In the late 80s, early 90s, American cinema started changing dramatically. On the one hand, multiplexes and summer blockbusters were well on their way to taking over. On the other, a new wave of rebellious, commercially savvy independent artists were rising to importance by defying Hollywood formula. This was the time when the Sundance Film Festival was exploding. Careers were being launched seemingly overnight. A burgeoning art house circuit was allowing smaller movies not only to be seen, but to succeed and thrive. Even major studios started opening distribution wings specifically for indie films. It was a time of tremendous leaps forward in representation on screen. Spike Lee exploded onto the scene with She's Gotta Have It, paving the way for black filmmakers like Robert Townsend, Leslie Harris, and John Singleton. Christine Vachon started killer films and all but launched the new queer cinema with major films by gay and lesbian directors like Todd Haynes, Tom Kalin, and Rose Troche. Amidst all that prosperity and progress, there was a critical absence. Very few films by and about queer people of color were finding the same ready opportunities as their white counterparts. Feeling an urgent need to address this exclusion, one young filmmaker started creating a body of work that, in many ways, was the first of its kind. She would eventually become the first black lesbian director to make a narrative film about and starring a black lesbian. Her name is Cheryl Dunye. Dunye started making films as an art student in the early 90s, experimental shorts that took a few stylistic cues from the deconstructed narratives of Jean-Luc Godard and drew heavily from her own life experiences. This was partly born of practicality. She was working with limited resources, favors from friends and family, whatever equipment she could get her hands on, so she needed things she could feasibly film. But there was a deeper purpose at work. When Dunye was starting out, there were very few places she could turn to for influence, to see her own experiences reflected. There was the poetry of Sapphire, the writing of Audre Lorde. In film, there were the trailblazing documentaries of Michelle Parkerson and Marlon Riggs. It was obvious there was an artistic community forming, remarkable voices beginning to emerge, but a lot of it was still in its nascent stages. Mostly what she felt was the absence. There were directors truthfully portraying black lives. There were directors truthfully portraying LGBTQ lives. Almost no one seemed to be looking at the complicated intersection between the two. Her films would shine a much-needed light upon that milieu. To start, all she had to do was turn the camera on herself and be totally honest. Her early works took the form of confessional monologues, Dunye acting as both author and subject. Later, narrative stories were introduced, layered frequently with autobiographical asides, direct-to-camera commentary. These films matter-of-factly confronted race and sexuality, simply as a consequence of Dunye matter-of-factly confronting her own life. She developed a relaxed ease with the camera. She spoke always in her own voice, fearlessly scrutinized her past, her family, her relationships, and the juxtaposition of cultures in which she and others like her existed. She revealed herself and the world around her with unusual clarity. Her distinctive style, a playful mixture of fiction and non-fiction, documentary and narrative, emphasized a nimble capacity for self-reflexiveness, introspection, and observation. Appropriately, she dubbed this style Dunye-mentory. Over a 6-year period, she made about 6 of these Dunye-mentories, each one funny, intelligent, inquisitive, each skillfully refining her unconventional techniques. Her form would reach its apex in 1996 with the release of The Watermelon Woman, her first feature film. For her first feature, Dunye was ready to push herself to new places. The Watermelon Woman would widen her perspective. She would tackle the erasures of the past as well as the present. The project had its origins in the essential texts of Donald Bogle and Vito Russo, who had both broken new ground with their historical perspectives of Black and LGBTQ representation in film, respectively. Both had impacted her, but again there was an absence. No academic text looking specifically at the cinematic contributions of queer Black women. Dunye started doing research. She came up against a woeful lack of information. Whatever might have existed, she couldn't loan out from archives. It was beyond her budget. She knew people like her had existed and made a mark in the industry, so she would tell their stories even if she had to invent one. Influenced by Jim McBride's mischievous 1967 film David Holtzman's Diary, she started constructing a scenario. Part of it would carry on the momentum of her Dunye mentories. Dunye would star as Cheryl, a videographer precariously navigating the hazards of dating, whose life begins to complicate in unexpected ways when she's drawn into a passionate romance with a white woman. The rest of the film would unearth a buried past. Cheryl's pet project is a documentary she's assembling on an obscure actress from early Hollywood, billed only as the Watermelon Woman. Finding information mostly in cast-off boxes forgotten by careless white curators, she begins to unlock a fascinating story, the career of Faye Richards, one of the first Black lesbians in Hollywood, a woman beloved and exploited in her time, now all but lost to history. Dunye, in collaboration with photographer Zoe Leonard, constructed a whole archive for the fictional Faye Richards, which she effectively presents as genuine. It's a triumph of ingenuity, and what it communicates is no less authentic just because it happens to be about a fictional subject. Talented performers, venerated in their own communities, reduced to demeaning stereotypes in mainstream Hollywood. Identities ignored and deliberately erased. Humanity trapped beneath the surface, demanding to be seen and celebrated. The Watermelon Woman is one of those great debut films, fully asserting a personal style, full of infectious enthusiasm, driven by clear-eyed purpose. Dunye's honesty is so bracing that the film feels, at times, jarringly contemporary. There are sharp observations of problems we're still painfully trying to bring out into the open. It's one of the essential movies of the 90s, a vibrant snapshot of Philadelphia's lesbian cultural scene at that moment, and a vital glimpse of lives too seldom seen on screen. Dunye's film was a hit at festivals, winning awards in Berlin and LA, and eventually finding theatrical distribution with first-run features. It also became a focal point for controversy surrounding the National Endowment for the Arts. Dunye had received a $30,000 grant from the organization, and the NEA, often a target for conservative politicians, was accused of using taxpayer money to finance pornography. Of course, Dunye's film had been no more explicit than any studio release of that time, but among many films by gay and lesbian artists, it was her film that was one of the most viciously singled out. Dunye was not even invited to testify in defense of her own film. Sadly, this led to a restructuring in the NEA that made it more difficult for certain artists to receive funding, effectively de-amplifying the marginalized voices it had worked to uplift. The incident served as further fuel for Dunye's work. She had made history, a landmark, the first narrative film about Black lesbians visibly made by a Black lesbian. But it was only a start. What was she going to do next? Unfortunately, there were many tough years ahead. For a long time, Dunye did not find many bigger opportunities forthcoming. Nobody in the industry seemed to want to hear her ideas. It would be about 6 years before she made another film. That was Stranger Inside, a prison drama for HBO. Stranger Inside was the result of 4 years of research into women's prisons. Dunye actually spent much of that time with real prisoners, learning their lives, workshopping the script in collaboration with these women, and encouraging them to tell their own stories. It was a move away from the experimental form of her Dunye mentories. The harsh subject matter lent a darker, more severe tone to the film, in contrast to the warmth and humor of her earlier work. But like that earlier work, the film set out to tear down cliches and stereotypes, to offer something honest and authentic. Stranger Inside led to Dunye getting her first agents and first studio gig. In 2004, she directed the comedy My Baby's Daddy for Miramax. The experience was not a good one. The film was re-edited, totally without her knowledge or input, and released to abysmal reviews. Things got worse from there. Dunye went through some personal struggles, a major breakup, and decided to step away from filmmaking for a while to travel. She spent some time in Amsterdam before returning to the United States around 2008. By the time she got back, the filmmaking scene had changed completely. Most of the interest in the indie circuit had started to dry up. Studios were beginning to invest more in franchises. Dunye had already learned that studio gigs were not her end game. All she wanted was to tell her stories. Sadly, funding was getting harder and harder to come by. She was going to have to start all over. Supporting herself with teaching jobs, she eventually released her next film, The Owls, in 2010. A micro-budget thriller, the film follows two dysfunctional lesbian couples, former bandmates whose careers never took off, grappling with bitterness and regret, not to mention a murder they're trying desperately to keep secret. When a mysterious stranger shows up, paranoia starts breaking loose. It was a return to the personal, experimental style of Dunye's youth. She had obviously gone through a lot in the time since Watermelon Woman. The film is a reflection of that. The Owls, ironically an acronym for Older, Wiser Lesbians, is a brooding, sometimes bleak meditation on aging, with characters who have all failed to maintain a sense of purpose in their ever-evolving social environment. There's very little concern with genre mechanics. Dunye instead probes issues. She invites her collaborators to share, on camera, their own individual thoughts on age, sexuality, gender identity, the emerging generational gaps in lesbian culture. Sometimes they speak in character, sometimes they speak as themselves. The film presents a compelling variety of viewpoints on themes almost never explored by other artists. It showed just how much Dunye had left to say. In 2012, she went to Germany to make Mommy is Coming, a look at lesbian BDSM culture, and in 2014, she released the short Black is Blue, following struggles with identity in the life of a trans man, which she has since been working on expanding into a feature. But the personal experiences of queer people of color remain some of the most crucial and difficult to get on screen. As of this video, Dunye hasn't been able to make a feature film in about 8 years. Art always speaks most distinctly in a voice that is individual. One of the questions I'm most fascinated by is how directors work to make those individual voices heard. The sacrifices involved, the obstacles to overcome, the tough choices that exist between personal expression and mass commerce. Rarely do those two paths ever run parallel. With someone like Dunye, the situation is compounded by ever-present barriers placed against her race, gender, and sexuality. There still aren't many people like her in the industry, and so there aren't many willing to offer her the opportunities your average white male director might receive. She has to fight that much harder to innovate and create truthful work. Despite everything Dunye has accomplished in her pioneering career, we've seen only the smallest handful of films comparable to hers come along in all the years since Watermelon Woman. She herself has come dangerously close to vanishing into obscurity, victim to the exact same kind of erasure she so knowingly portrayed in her film. Watermelon Woman was unavailable on DVD or streaming platforms for many years. First Run Features finally made it widely available again for its 20th anniversary in 2016. It's now part of the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art, and currently available to stream on Amazon Prime. The Criterion Channel as well is featuring a collection of Dunye's films, spotlighting Watermelon Woman, The Owls, and most of her shorts. It's some long overdue recognition for a woman increasingly identified as one of the most influential Black lesbian artists in American film. The thriving and rapidly diversifying landscape of television and streaming has steered Dunye's work in a new direction. She has been getting consistent and prominent work for the first time in her career, directing episodes of Claws, The Chi, Dear White People, Queen Sugar, and the upcoming Lovecraft Country. Dunye is currently working on producing an adaptation of Jewel Gomez's 1991 Afrofuturist queer vampire novel, The Gilda Stories, through Jingletown Films, her own production company. Founded in 2018, the mission of Jingletown Films is to create a platform for diverse storytellers and filmmakers to share their experiences and uplift their authentic artistic voices. In a way, she is working harder than ever before to create the wealth of opportunity she was not afforded in her youth. In a business of ever-narrowing focus and increasingly infrequent innovation, it's undaunted artists like Dunye that enrich the art form and provide hope for the future.